Okay. So as I mentioned before, I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and I am the one who compiled these Academy productivity rankings. However, actually, this is not the first time that we've had the rankings at Training Ground Guru. And I'm just going to give you a little backstory before I unveil the rankings. So originally, these were made by Mark Crane, and they were done as recently as 2017-18 after that season. And Mark started those rankings because he had a son who was getting involved in the academy setup and wanted to know how to best um, serve his son, really. And at the time, and still currently, the Premier League and EFL don't release statistics on which academies are the best at producing professional players. And so Mark kind of took it upon himself to gather that information so he can make the most informed decision for his son. So that's kind of the backdrop, and why this is so important is to make the academy process a little bit more transparent. So parents know some of the top academies, and even also coaching practitioners know as well. So without further ado, let's get into the rankings. As you can see here, the overall rankings, these are just the first 30 clubs in the rankings. And just to explain a little bit how these rankings were made. So we took all of the English eligible players from Football Reference. So if you go to Football Reference, the top 5 leagues in England, every single English eligible player we took and traced their academy history up until the age of 18. I think it was something close to 2,000 players in total. And then for each player, we gave them, if they played in the Premier League, they got 5 points. If they played in the Championship, they got 4 points. And then those points were split between each academy. So, for example, if we just take a club here like Middlesbrough, who's number 9, you'll see that they have zero 0.5 of players that played in the Premier League. You're wondering, how do you have half a player? That means that that one player, in this case it was Ben Godfrey, played with Middlesbrough, but he also played at another academy before the age of 18. Therefore, we've split that value to both Middlesbrough and the other academy. Another example, Reading, right? You think, how can we have 1.16 Premier League players? They actually have had 3 players that have played in their academy at some point before the age of 18 and gone into the Premier League. And that actually, they've had 2 players that have played at 3 clubs before the age of 18. So that's what these decimals mean. And then each one of these, has the point totals totaled up, and then you get the total weighting on the side. That's how we've done it. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask at the end of this. I'll be doing a Q&A. And also this table we'll be putting on the website in the coming weeks. But we wanted you to kind of have a first look at it. And so as you can see, these are the first 30. I'll be showing you the next 30 after this. But if you want to just take a minute or two and you can have a look here and see what stands out. Some interesting clubs. Charlton have made the top 15 in each one of the 3 rankings that we've had. So they've been top 15, which is quite good for a Category 2 club. As you can see, Crewe Alexandra, another top club, they're from Category 2. The top 3, Manchester United, Arsenal, and Chelsea, respectively. So now if we go to the part 2 in the rankings, these are the next 30 or so. There's actually 83 clubs in general. We've only taken the categories 1, 2, and 3 clubs. So for example, Huddersfield is not a category 1, 2, or 3 club, so they weren't in the rankings. However, actually, interestingly, they would have been 19th. So they would have been quite high, even though they're not a category 1, 2, or 3 club. AFC Wimbledon is the highest ranked Category 3 club, and we'll be hearing from Michael Hamilton, their academy manager, shortly. Interestingly, Stoke City is the lowest Category 1 club in 63rd place. The bottom 20 we don't have here just because there's only so much space on the screen. Interestingly, if we look at the biggest risers in the compared to the last rankings 3 years ago, it would be Peterborough, Burnley, and Fleetwood Town, and each one of those rose roughly 20 places in the last 3 years. So they've made big strides in the last 3 years. So you could take a look in this and see which clubs did well and which didn't. And just, it is worth maintaining that this is based on last season. So Watford, for example, are in tier 2 last season. Obviously, they're in the Premier League now, so that will be reflected in next year's potentially. But these are the overall rankings, and please leave any questions for me to answer later. So let's get into some interesting insights that aren't reflected in those in the main table, if you were. Players produced, as Nick referred to earlier in his presentation, one of the primary things is producing professionals. All right, he mentioned Paul McShane didn't actually play for Manchester United's first team. So this table here shows just how many players have come through the academy. So Manchester United and Arsenal had 69 players last year in the top 5 English leagues that came through the academy at some point in time. But if you look at the numbers, Manchester United actually had more players that played exclusively at their academy, whereas Arsenal had more players that played maybe at other academies and theirs. So maybe they didn't retain them, or maybe they came from a different academy first. So this just shows the value really of people of the academy for producing that talent. And that's why there's a discrepancy between Arsenal and Manchester United at number 1 and 2. Some really interesting figures here for high performing academies from the championship. We have here Middlesbrough number 6 and Reading number 9. Really elite academies that maybe aren't as good in their first team, but in their academy they are as good as producing professional players as almost anyone in the country, which you can see on this table, ahead of some really big hitters like Manchester City and West Ham and Liverpool. Number 12th on this chart, which you can't see, is Crewe Alexandra with 40 as well, and they are the highest Category 2 club, and have a track record for producing a lot of professionals. And so in one way, this is also another way of kind of determining productivity and success. Some other interesting things just to note, this last bullet point where I say the average Category 1 produced roughly twice as many players as the average Category 2 club. So the median Cat 1 club produced 28 professional players. The average Cat 2 club produced about 15 players. So quite a big difference. And it really shows that Category 1 clubs are better at producing professionals compared to the other categories. And just to compare, Category 3 clubs on average produce about 9 players. So you really, if you end up at one of those maybe lower categories, the likelihood of you becoming a professional is reduced. So let's move on as well. So it's interesting, on this table, we're looking at overall production of academies, but we're talking over the course of 10, 15, 20 years even. To give an example, Gary Cahill would count on Aston Villa's academy, even though he was there from 2000 to 2004, because he played last year. Now, that's really great for Aston Villa's academy, but maybe is not the best metric to determining their current productivity. So the best way to kind of look at that is to look at players that are maybe 23 and under, which shows the last 5, maybe 10 years of the academy, and which clubs are the most productive there. And when you filter those results, you see quite a different top 10. So just an example, City went from 7th overall to number 4 in 23 and under rankings. And that kind of shows the investment they've made in the last decade at the club. Interestingly, Fulham, number 10 in 23 and under rankings. And if you look at the overall, they're number 21. So an 11 place jump for Fulham. And then West Brom moving up to number 9 from, I believe, 15th place. Those are some of the biggest risers. And then you also see kind of the opposite. Southampton, who is number 5 overall, I think we all know their famous youth academy. If you look at their 23 and under group, they're actually all the way at 12. So, a step down for them in recent years compared to where they were before, potentially. And then something else kind of to flag up, Liverpool, who I've mentioned here, they're number 11. And it seems like they have a slightly different tact than maybe some of these other academies, in that 10 of the 20 players that are 23 and under for them actually started at another club. So it seems as though in the recent years, they've placed more emphasis on recruiting players, maybe at the age of 16 when, they become scholars. So just something interesting when you kind of dig behind the numbers a bit. And then lastly, Premier League players. So we're talking about elite talents, elite players. Here's where you see really the dominance of Category 1 clubs. So Premier League players are come predominantly from Category 1 clubs, about 61% of them. And Category 1 clubs, when you really divide it out, are about 3 times more likely to produce a Premier League player than a Category 2 player. So I think the average Premier League or the average Category 1 club produces about 4.5 Premier League players, whereas the average Category 2 club produces about 1.5. And the distance is even more vast when you get to Category 3 clubs, where it's 8 times the difference or so. So if you want to be playing at the elite level, there's a much higher chance that you need to be playing at a Category 1 club. It doesn't mean you have to. As you can see, 40% is still high coming from non-Category 1 clubs, but it is striking when you look at the statistics. And that is all. So this is really kind of a snapshot of the academy system and the big picture. And I hope that was informative. And just before we get to the questions, there are a couple things that this doesn't take into account. So for example, for many years, Manchester United and some of the top academies would bring in foreign players at the age of 16. We mentioned Paul McShane, he is Irish. He would not fall under this, so he would not count for the Manchester United Academy. And that's one loophole. And then also because of that, the Welsh teams, Cardiff, Swansea, Newport County, as they're all Welsh nationalities, their players largely don't show up in these statistics as well. So there is a couple of outliers there, or things that aren't considered. And hopefully in the years to come, we can, adjust for that. But at the moment, they're not. But hopefully this gives you a good snapshot of, who's doing well, maybe who's not doing quite as well. And hopefully it's a bit more transparent for everyone involved, really.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Really interesting and fantastic work pulling it all together, because it's a major piece of research. Yeah, I was just going to say, Nick Cox actually has posted a good point here. He says, great work pulling this together. Context is everything. For example, Cambridge ranks 60th, but they do amazing work with the resource available to them. They overachieve, as many do. Lots of great work being done across the country. So, that's a very good point there.
100%. We are quite open, or I'm at least quite open, that we don't have the funding and the resources in this rankings. We don't say how much each club is applying, how many staff they have. I mean, that's partially present within the categories, because each category has a certain requirement that they have to meet. But Nick is 100% correct. And I'm just going to go back to the rankings so people can look at that, while we go through any questions. Are there any questions, Simon?
Yeah, there are some. I'm just replying to a couple here. A good one here from Morton. He says, are players from abroad included in the statistics? Oh, sorry,
No.
let me go on. If a player goes from an academy to a top 5 league outside the UK without playing in England, will they be included?
Unfortunately, not in these. I mean, that is something hopefully we'll take into account in the coming years, but they're not included in this rankings. So, for example, next year when we do this, Fikayo Tomori from Chelsea, who's playing at AC Milan now, would not be included in these rankings, and that is one of the things that limitations of this study we do understand, but unfortunately, we just don't have that at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and a good point from Andy here, which you touched on in the presentation, but is it inevitable that a Cat 1 will produce more pro players? Maybe not inevitable, but it's heavily weighted, isn't it, in their favor, I guess, because of the resources they have.
Of course, yeah, undoubtedly. When you commit more resources and there's more investment, there's more requirements to get outcomes from those investments. But as these rankings hopefully show, there are a number of category 2 and category 3 clubs that maybe don't have quite as many resources that are doing just as well, if not better. I highlighted some category 1 clubs that are a bit further down on the rankings, like Stoke, and there are a number that we'll talk to Michael Hamilton shortly, whose club AFC Wimbledon is 33rd in the rankings and above a few category 1 clubs. So it shows that you don't need just the resources to have a productive club. And I'll just touch on once more Charlton. They've been in the top 15 all 3 of the rankings, and I mean, there are lots of other clubs in London that have more resources, including potentially Crystal Palace, and they've been above them every time. So it's not just about how much resources you have, although that is helpful, of course.
Yeah. No, I've got a few more actually, so we can rattle through these. Andy has asked, when you say an academy produces a Premier League player, how do you define this? If a player makes 1 sub-appearance, does that classify them as a Premier League player and provide the academy with 5 points?
Yeah, so I mean, that is one of the limitations, is it is just a person who made an appearance and played a game. But what you'll actually find when you do the research, for the most part, not 100%, but the minutes for all of these clubs really line up. So it's not like, I mean, you have a club that has 5 or 6, academy products that play 1 game, get 1 appearance, and therefore their Premier League status or they get more points. So for the most part, that's not that common. But yeah, it was just based on 1 appearance.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. Adam David from Maccabi Haifa, he just said, can you explain how it works for the 23 and under table again, just to go through that?
So if we go through to the 23 and under, so essentially what I've done is I've done exactly what you saw in the main table, but just taken it for players that were 23 and under at the time that this was compiled, which was at the end of August. So if they were 23 and under at that point in time, they were included in these rankings. So obviously that's a bit arbitrary. It might look a little bit different if it was 22 and under versus 24 and under, but I mean, this is hopefully to provide a snapshot of the clubs that are doing a little bit better more recently. And I think it does, show an accurate job of that.